Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about blood vessels. So as we move away from talking about blood and then talking about the heart, we're now going to talk about the peripheral vessels. So there are vessels within the heart, but then also we see, or I should say outside of the heart, but also we see that there are blood vessels all throughout the body. So keep in mind that the whole idea is that we're trying to circulate everything around the body. We're trying to get oxygen and nutrients around the body. So we need blood vessels everywhere. And it's going to start from the heart with very big blood vessels, the big arteries. And as we move away towards the capillaries, they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until they get down to the size of a single red blood cell. And then on its way back, they're going to get larger and larger and larger until they get to the superior and inferior vena cava, and which is a very large vessel and filters back into the heart. So blood vessels are classified by their size and histological or microscopic organization, and they're instrumental in overall cardiovascular regulation. They're very important in order to make sure that the oxygen and those nutrients are getting to where they're supposed to go, and the waste products and that carbon dioxide is getting removed from the tissue. So arteries, they carry blood away from the heart. Remember, we talk about typically these are going to have oxygen rich blood in them, but when we talk about pulmonary arteries, that's the one exception where there is not oxygen rich blood in an artery. Once we get further away from the heart, they start to branch off into these smaller branches called arterioles, and then it's going to go to the capillary beds or the capillaries, and then once the exchange occurs, we're going to see that they're going to start moving back towards the heart through the venules and then eventually to the veins. The largest blood vessels are going to be attached to the heart. You have the pulmonary trunk, which carries blood from the right ventricle to that pulmonary circuit. Remember, it comes back through the pulmonary veins. And we have the aorta, which is going to leave through the left ventricle, carries the blood from the left ventricle to the systemic circuit. The smallest blood vessels are our capillaries. So we have our arteries that are going to go to our arterioles and then make it to our capillaries and come back through the venules and then our veins. The capillaries are going to be very thin. That is where chemicals and gas exchange is going to diffuse across through the membranes or through the vessels to the tissues. The larger vessels have these three layers to them. The innermost layer is called the tunica intima. Then the one in between is the tunica media. And then you have the outer one, which is the tunica externa. So there are some differences between the arteries and the veins. The biggest one that we talk about is that arteries do not have valves to them and veins do have valves to them. So arteries and veins run side by side. Arteries have thicker walls and higher blood pressure. So the arteries, they're going to have these thicker walls in order to maintain or keep up with that higher blood pressure. You don't want any break in the vessels. Collapsed artery has a small round lumen to them. And then you have vein has a large flat lumen to them or tube-like structure to them. And vein lining contracts while artery lining does not contract. So you want it to contract in order to force that blood to get back to the heart. But in the arteries, since they're under higher pressure, they don't need those contractions. Artery lining have folds, and then the arteries are more elastic so that they can take that higher blood pressure in them. And then, like I said, one of the main ones that we talk about are that veins have valves. Arteries, elasticity allows that to keep up with that pressure or allows for that pressure to be there. Contractility, when we talk about contractility, we're talking about the arteries change in the diameter. So it's controlled by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. You're going to have vasoconstriction, which is going to be making them smaller, and then you're going to have vasodilation, which is going to be making those vessels wider. It's going to affect the afterload of the heart, the peripheral blood pressure, the blood pressure in our periphery, and the capillary blood flow. So remember this term aneurysm. We talked about brain aneurysms, but there can be aneurysms elsewhere, which is a weak spot in a vessel, and it's going to cause that outpatching, and it can eventually rupture and then lead to a lack of oxygen to the tissues. This just gives you an idea of the structure of the different vessels. So in veins, in the larger ones, we have that tunica externa, tunica media, and that tunica intima. Same goes for the larger arteries. And then once we move down to our venules and our arterioles, we see that we don't have that tunica media or that tunica intima. We just have that tunica externa and endothelium. And eventually, once we get to the capillaries, they are just going to have this endothelial cells to them and that basement membrane, so that allows for that diffusion to occur. So capillaries are very small vessels with thin walls, and it's going to allow for that diffusion to occur. It's an endothelial tube inside a thin basement membrane, no tunica media, no tunica externa, and the diameter is similar to the diameter of a red blood cell. So only one red blood cell at a time can flow through a capillary. Angiogenesis is when we're talking about formation of new blood vessels. So sometimes you hear about them removing a blood vessel. If you have varicose veins, they might remove varicose veins, and ultimately, your body's going to do everything to make new routes for that blood to flow through to the tissue. So we call those the creation of those new vessels angiogenesis. Veins are going to then collect all the blood from the capillaries in the tissues and the organs and return it back to the heart. They have a larger diameter than the arteries, thinner walls than arteries, and they have lower blood pressure. Because of that lower blood pressure, we see that is why we need valves. Okay, we want things to flow through. Okay, but then if it tries to go backwards, okay, we want it to slam shut. We want it to be closed. So the blood is able to push its way through these valves, but is not able to make its way back down. So that is why we have those valves, so that the veins don't have the pressure that the arteries have behind them. So they need to have these valves to stop things from going backwards, to force things to continue to go forward. And ultimately, a big part of blood getting back to our heart is that we are always moving. So you see in older individuals, people that are bedridden, all right, their circulation is not very good because they're not really moving. So that blood is not circulating the way that it should. Distribution of blood, heart, arteries, capillaries, we see about 30 to 35% of the blood volume, and then in the venous system, the veins, we're going to see 60 to 65% of that blood volume. 1/3 of the venous blood is in the large venous networks of the liver, the bone marrow, and the skin. All right, the liver has its own hepatic system of circulation, and that is going to hold a lot of the venous blood at any given time. When we're talking about blood pressure, that is arterial pressure. So when you're measuring the pressure, you are measuring the pressure that we hear in the brachial artery. Venous pressure would be when we're talking about the pressure in the veins, which is very low pressure. But when we're measuring blood pressure, we're measuring the arterial pressure, the pressure that is in those major arteries. Capillary hydrostatic pressure is the pressure within the capillary beds. But the big one that we like to measure is the blood pressure, the arterial pressure. When we look at arterial pressure or the blood pressure, we're talking about the systolic pressure, which is the top number that we look at when we say 120/80. That top number is the systolic pressure, which is the peak arterial pressure during ventricular systole, when that ventricle really contracts. And then we have the diastolic pressure, which is the minimum arterial pressure during diastole. We have terms that we talk about. Hypertension is high blood pressure. Hypotension is low blood pressure. Anything greater than 140/90, we're going to call that hypertension. But typically, we're looking at 120/80 as being the norm. If you have 125/85, 125/75, somewhere around there, then that is still considered normal. No one's going to be exactly 120/80, but you want it to be close. You don't want your systolic pressure to be above 140, or ultimately you don't want it to be above 130. But if you see that it is approaching 140, if it's 150, then we run into issues. Same thing goes for the diastolic pressure. You don't want it to be at 100. Same thing goes for hypotension. You don't want your blood pressure to be too low. That's how people pass out. People don't get enough oxygen to their tissues, to their brain. So that's an issue as well. But we see more, as Americans, we don't take care of our bodies, and we have terrible diets, and we have atherosclerosis, and all of this stuff is going to lead to hypertension. So typically we're more worried about hypertension, but people do have hypotension and issues with blood flow as well. So know those two terms. And then moving forward, you want to make sure that you understand that these different vessels do have specific names to them, just like everything else in anatomy where we have specific names to things. So once we move away from the aorta, we have these major vessels that are going to branch off. We have the brachiocephalic trunk, we have the left subclavian artery, we have the left common carotid artery, the right common carotid artery, and then they are going to move on to other major arteries. We have this descending aorta, which is then going to go to the other major arteries that are lower in the body, the deep femoral artery, the femoral artery. All of these have their own terms. We see that the major arteries in the lower part of the body are also have names, and then all of these large arteries are going to branch off into arterioles, and then they're going to go to the tissues through the capillaries. The same thing goes for the veins. They have specific names to them. So as they are leaving the capillaries and leaving the venules, then the venules are going to feed back into these major veins, and the major veins are going to come back to the heart through the superior and the inferior vena cava. So understand that just like we have an ulnar artery and a radial artery, we also have a radial vein and an ulnar vein. And just as a final talking point, some effects of aging in the cardiovascular system. There's 5 age-related changes in the heart. We see reduced maximum cardiac output. The heart's not putting out as much as it once did. Changes in nodal and conducting cells, reduced elasticity of the fibrous skeleton, the cardiac skeleton, and progressive atherosclerosis, the narrowing of those vessels, and replacement of damaged cardiac muscle cells by scar tissue. 3 age-related changes in the blood vessels. We see our arteries become less elastic, calcium deposits on the vessel walls, and a thrombus or thrombi can form. All right, those plaques from atherosclerosis can form. They can break off, and then you throw a clot. So keep that in mind when we talk about healthy diet, not smoking, things that are going to push these things along, make them worse as you age. So keep these things in mind as we're moving forward, as we're wrapping up this unit on the circulatory system, on the cardiac system. So we talked about blood, we talked about the heart, and now we're talking about the blood vessels before we move on to the next unit.